He may have worn a fancy suit and flaunted a luxurious lifestyle. He may have acted like he was a proud girl dad. But make no mistake, you are looking at a cold-blooded monster. This is a case that has left many of us who followed it from the very beginning with chills and so many questions. How could a father take the life of his young child after what seemed to be a wonderful dad and daughter vacation? The trial of Luciano Frattolin just came to a stunning conclusion, and I will show you the disturbing notes that he left behind that gives us insight into the why a man with such a dark and twisted mind would take the life of his 9-year-old girl. We're on the case, presented by Law&Crime. I'm Chris Stewart. I remember when this story first broke. I was looking at my phone, I was in my kitchen, it was a Saturday, and the story was that an Amber Alert had gone out in upstate New York for a 9-year-old girl who was kidnapped, or at least that was the story, that she was kidnapped from her car. That's how all of this started, really as a parent's worst nightmare. A father who called 911 claiming that his daughter was yanked from their vehicle when they were pulled over on the side of the road as they were making their way back home after an East Coast vacation. But then we learned, and honestly pretty quickly, that the nightmare in this story was actually that parent who called for help. Here's a picture of Luciano Frattolin and his 9-year-old daughter, Melina. They lived in Montreal, and in July of last year, the two of them were on a dad and daughter adventure across the border into New York. They went through Connecticut. They spent 10 days seeing the sights on the East Coast and going to places like New York City. Frattolin was a small business owner in Canada. He tried to run a coffee company, and when you look online, he's a guy who loved luxury. He drove Ferraris. He traveled the world. But he also, at least publicly, made it seem like he loved his daughter. His biography online for his company said that Melina, his daughter, was the light of his life. He said she was the inspiration for everything. Now, I'll be honest, I don't want to show you too many nice pictures of Luciano, too many nice pictures of he and his daughter together, because the real image of who this man is and what you should think of when you see him and hear him is this: handcuffed, being taken into court where he was accused of killing his daughter at the end of that trip. Now, Luciano Frattolin's trial just wrapped up in Essex County, New York, and I'm going to play for you the moment that the jury delivered the verdict. But I also want to lay out all the layers to how this twisted story began. So we need to go back to July 2025, specifically Saturday the 19th. It was around 10 o'clock at night when Luciano calls 911 from the side of a highway near Lake George in New York.
Warren County 911 received a call from a man reporting his 9-year-old daughter missing with a possible abduction in the area of exit 22 of I-87 Northway in Lake George.
That's New York State Police holding a news conference. They sprinted to the area where Frattolin was claiming that his daughter was yanked from their car on the side of the road. A vehicle pulls up, pulls her out, and then speeds off into the darkness. He claimed that he had pulled over to the side of the road because he needed to get out to go to the bathroom. The two of them were on their way back to the Canadian border, and Luciano was going to drop Melina off at her mom's house in Montreal. Police, they put out an Amber Alert in hopes they would find the girl and this mysterious vehicle that Luciano said took her. The next day, this search came to a terrible end.
A search detail comprised of officers from multiple agencies conducted an organized search in the town of Ticonderoga, New York. In an area Mr. Frattolin was suspected of having visited. During that search detail, at approximately 10:50, members of the New York State Police Forest Rangers located Melina deceased in the shallow portion of a pond.
The story that Luciano told was a bold-faced lie. Police say they investigated it. They looked for this mysterious vehicle that he talked about, but they determined that his entire story about what happened was made up, and worse, he was the one who killed his daughter.
At about 5:30 p.m. on July 20th, Melina is observed with her father on video surveillance in Saratoga Springs, New York. At about 6:30 p.m., she spoke to her mother on the phone and told her she and her father were en route back to Canada. The child appeared to be in good health and did not indicate she was under any duress. The investigation has determined sometime after Melina's phone call with her mother and before Mr. Frattolin's 911 call, he allegedly murdered Melina and left her body in a remote area where she was later discovered by law enforcement.
I want you to think about that for a moment. These final moments of this little girl who had just spent 10 days with her dad in New York. And on the way home, and it seems right before he took her life, he let her call her mom. The two of them speaking, neither of them knowing it was the last time they would speak. And he allowed her to tell his mom that she was on her way home. But then he killed her. An autopsy determined that Melina died of suffocation by drowning. Her body was found pinned beneath a fallen tree and a rock. Now, we spoke to a woman back when all of this was first breaking. And it was a woman who said that night she was on her way around 7 o'clock at night to a restaurant with her husband. And she saw that vehicle that Frattolin was driving parked on the side of the road. And she says she made eye contact with Luciano. This is what she told me.
And when we locked eyes, I'm never going to forget his face. Never. When I saw him walk out of that courthouse, someone sent me a video and I said, oh my God, that is freaking him. Like, that is him. I will never forget his face. It was like a fear, but like a cold, angry look is all I can describe it as.
Now, Frattolin was arrested in July of 2025. This was not a whodunit for that long, and he's been in custody ever since. But he stuck to his story through the 12 months that this case went on. He pleaded not guilty, and he had the chance to fight for his innocence in court. Now, look, in a case like this, it can feel like it's not really much of a mystery. Seems like from the very beginning, police were incredibly confident. They knew exactly what happened. And we'll talk a little bit more about Luciano's personal life here in a moment and some of the red flags that didn't show up when you look at him on social media, but certainly beneath the surface were going on. But the real mystery, and even to an extent a mystery that still remains to this day, is why he would do something like this. Why would this dad, who actually had just celebrated his daughter's 9th birthday, posted tons of pictures about it just a couple months prior to this trip, why would he kill her in such a brutal way after 10 days of them being together and seeing the sights? Now, for this trial, it lasted roughly 3 weeks. Cameras were not allowed in the courtroom, but cameras were allowed when the verdict was read. The defense at trial, they maintained that the story of Melina being kidnapped, it was true. According to WCAX TV in New York, Luciano says that he was never in Ticonderoga the night that Melina was killed. That's where her body was found. The defense also reportedly argued, where's the DNA? They say there was no physical evidence that actually tied their client to the scene and to the murder of Melina Frattolin. The prosecution, though, they said they have the receipts. And the receipts, cell phone data and car data, they say laid out where Frattolin was minute by minute the night that his daughter died. And on top of that, and this was new information that we did not know as we covered this investigation for the last year, there are some incredibly disturbing, cryptic, and suspicious notes that were apparently found during the investigation that painted a dark picture of who Luciano Frattolin was. And these are pictures of his soul that a social media post can't show. The Montreal Gazette reports that several handwritten notes were found in Luciano's car, the same car that he was in with his daughter the night that she died. One of those notes said that he did not want his daughter to suffer anymore. It's kind of unclear what he meant by that, but it seems he believed that Melina had some sort of mental health ailment. Investigators say that the notes were written in the months and the weeks leading up to the murder. According to the paper, Frattolin wrote, quote, "Don't let Melina suffer anymore and have a difficult upbringing." Another, they believe, was written in June of last year that says, quote, "Buy duct tape and make sure to bring a rain jacket." I mean, that was written weeks before they went on this trip. Police say that Melina's mom had full custody of Melina. Luciano would visit with Melina when he was in Montreal, but when you look at his social media, he was someone who seemed to live a life of kind of jet-setting luxury out on his own. And even though there have been accusations that he was under steep financial pressure and debt, La Presse, which is a French-Canadian newspaper, wrote that he was being sued by a bank for roughly $110,000 related to unpaid credit card debt. Now, when it comes to motive, though, it appears that the relationship that he had with Melina's mom was central to what happened in this case. There is a handwritten note that investigators talked about where Luciano writes something along the lines of saying that God came into his life to destroy Melina's mom. Quote, "This whole thing is a result of pure evil lies, he said. Quote, God, do not give me money until I end this evil. Now, it's also been reported that Luciano and Melina's mom, they were dating, they were never married, and they ended a long-distance relationship in 2019. Again, Melina was in the full custody of her mom, and Luciano would really only visit when he was in town. On top of those handwritten notes, investigators also say they found a 3-page press release that it appears Luciano wrote that reportedly focused on his desire to see Melina's mom put in prison for life so he could receive custody of their daughter. Now, these notes paint a dark picture of who this man really is and what was going on in his mind. They also lead police to a key piece of evidence. During the 2-week trial, the project manager of Frattolin's apartment building in Montreal said that he was 2 months behind on rent, so she went into his unit. And when that project manager ends up contacting law enforcement because she found some disturbing notes potentially about her in the apartment, law enforcement had an odd question for her. She asked if she knew where Luciano Frattolin got his dry cleaning done. She remembers that she saw 2 plastic bags, blue plastic dry cleaning bags in his apartment, the same kind of bag that law enforcement say they recovered with Melina's body in New York. Now, Luciano's trial went on for roughly 3 weeks, and on Monday, less than just 2 hours of deliberations, the jury reached their verdict. Here is that moment per WTEN.
As to count 1, charging the defendant with murder in the 2nd degree, what is the jury's verdict?
Guilty.
As to count 2, charging the defendant with concealment of a human corpse, what is the jury's verdict?
Guilty.
Members of the jury, is that your verdict?
Yes, it is.
Frattolin showed no emotion as he was found guilty. Frankly, he showed zero remorse throughout the entire trial. He just took his glasses off and he looked down. We really never saw much emotion out of him as he was being paraded in front of cameras by law enforcement after his arrest and each time he was brought into the courtroom. Before the verdict was read, though, he apparently spoke to the court and he told the judge that he really wanted to testify in his own defense. He declared his innocence, but he says he was advised not to testify in his own defense. Here's what the Essex County District Attorney told the media after the guilty verdict about why the cell phone data in this case was so important.
Knowing where he was and knowing he was telling people he was at other places was huge. Shutting his daughter's phone off so his mother couldn't tell where she was big. So the digital evidence in this case made the case.
That's per WTEN. Now, Frattolin now faces the possibility of spending 15 years to life in prison. He will be sentenced on October 14th. Joining us now to talk more about this from New York is criminal defense attorney and former prosecutor Safa Robinson-Ferrer. Always great to have you here on Law and Crime. We talked about this, I remember, when Luciano Frattolin was first arrested. Just first, he is found guilty of second-degree murder. This seems very premeditated based off everything that was laid out, that this was planned, he did this. Why in New York, though? Like when you hear second-degree murder, because a lot of people will see that and say, why isn't this a first-degree case?
Yeah, so in the state of New York, second-degree murder is when you intentionally cause the death of another person. And so first-degree murder is essentially an elevated step to that, but you often see that in cases where a police officer may have been murdered, or a judge, or somebody that has a special title, peace officer, individuals of that nature. And it's not to say that when the deceased is a civilian that a person can't be charged or accused of first-degree murder. And oftentimes in cases like this, you will see with civilians that there is a second-degree murder charge as opposed to a first-degree murder charge, which again can be reserved for judges and police officers and individuals who have special titles or special circumstances.
Frattolin is scheduled to be sentenced in October. I can't imagine he would get less than life. But like, what goes into, like, what happens now in figuring out, what his sentence will actually be?
Yeah, so now that he's been convicted, there's a couple of things that are going to happen. The court is going to order what we call a pre-sentence investigation, and the short term is PSI, and that's essentially a mechanism that the court will use to guide the court in its sentence. Anytime someone is sentenced to more than 6 months of incarceration, the court is required to order a PSI upon their sentencing date. And so they'll meet with probation. The probation officer will gather a number of, items from that individual, background information. It's almost like a social worky kind of tool. And so essentially they're going to compile a report to the judge, to the prosecutor, and to the defense attorney that will allow the court to sentence that individual. They will also reach out to the victim in this case, which unfortunately the victim is deceased, but will likely reach out to her mother. There may be victim impact statements that when sentencing comes will be read on behalf of the family. And ultimately, the court will allow the defense attorney to speak at sentencing, the defendant to speak at sentencing, and the prosecutor will have the last word at sentencing before the judge pronounces his or her sentence.
You look at this case, and I was shocked that he went with the defense that this story, and maybe that's the only thing they had, right? Because like the story just seemed so outrageous from the very beginning, not saying that people aren't kidnapped or anything like that, but it was pretty quick that law enforcement, and then once they were able to get the cell phone records to see where he had been that night, it seemed that the story that she was taken from the side of the road in upstate New York is just something that didn't happen. And yet they go to trial with it and try to argue that investigators never thoroughly looked at the kidnapping theory, even though they say they did. What do you make of the defense kind of going in that direction, knowing that there was going to be cell phone data shown at this trial, proving that he was in particular spots and including the area, at least nearby where Melina Frattollin's body was found?
When you see cases like that, typically the only thing that the defense can hone in on is the burden of proof argument, that the government has failed to meet each and every element of each and every offense beyond a reasonable doubt. And so you essentially will attack that for the jury and say, yeah, they may have this piece of evidence, but they don't have that. There's questions here. They didn't fully investigate the kidnapping charge. And so based on that lack of investigation or that lack of evidence or lack of direct evidence, because everything here appears to be circumstantial, jury, you must find the defendant not guilty because they have failed to meet their burden of proof beyond a reasonable doubt. And in a case like this, that's the likely tactic that the defense was going to take because they probably didn't have too much to work with, especially to your point, Chris, when you have cell phone data that would indicate that he's in the areas where this crime was committed and where she was ultimately found.
Yeah, we'll get to some of these handwritten notes that were reportedly presented at the trial in a second. But you look at the defense's argument was, where's the DNA? Like, where's the proof that he did it? I mean, certainly you can put him in the area. You can show that the story that he was given, and we haven't seen the interrogation video. Don't know if we ever will, but like, I can't imagine that matches up with what the data shows as far as where he was. I think he said he wasn't in Ticonderoga, New York that night where her body was found, and they're able to disprove that. But you don't have the kind of moment from point A to point B of like, she's in the car and then here she is, sadly dead in this pond. And there's no DNA evidence apparently on him or on her that ties him to it. How difficult of an argument is it to make though, where like, you still have a lot of circumstantial evidence that piles up where like a juror could just look and say like, okay, but she didn't magically end up in this pond dead.
Yeah. And so first things first is when you have someone that's deceased, juries will typically convict because they want some level of justice or accountability for the family. While they're sitting through the trial, there's a high likelihood that the victim's family is sitting there. We know that this was a young child and her mom and family members were probably sitting there. So the jury is in the courtroom looking at this family, feeling as though that they need to find or hold somebody accountable. And typically in a case like this, it is the defendant as long as there's enough circumstantial evidence to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. And so with the DNA evidence, a lot of times the prosecution will ask, there's no during jury selection, ladies and gentlemen, there's no DNA evidence here. Is this a case that you would expect that you would hear DNA evidence from? And you'll get your answers yes or no. In this particular case, it is surprising that there's no DNA evidence. However, because she was located in a pond, a lot of that may have washed away depending on the length of time that she would have been there, the positioning of her body, and things of that nature.
As a former prosecutor, and also, I mean, you join us so often here on Law and Crime and we talk about these stories. And I feel like in so many of them, you see a suspect and they come out with this story to police. And then if anybody who watches the interrogation videos we get, it's like the second and third question from law enforcement is where things start to break down. And in this case, he has this story that I'm not saying that people are not kidnapped on the side of the road. Unfortunately, those things, they do happen. It's just incredibly rare. Like when you hear a story like that, and in your experience, like where is it that these suspects and defendants, these criminals, like make the mistake where the story maybe in their head seemed very buttoned up and police are going to buy it, but at the end of the day, it just falls apart?
Well, at the end of the day, it only makes sense to them, and they typically will think that they've got things all squared away, that this story makes sense, that nobody's going to challenge them. In this particular instance, I think the defendant here, again, he alleged that she had been kidnapped. So he, for whatever reason, concocted in his mind that that was the perfect scapegoat for what actually happened without taking into consideration, again, cell phone data that's going to show that he was at particular locations at particular times, whether or not there was DNA evidence, whether or not police would find any other evidence, including these notes that were found at some point during the investigation that would essentially tie the pieces together. And I would credit the police department in this case because it seems that when they were informed by the defendant that this was a potential kidnapping case, they didn't just stop there with thinking, oh, this is a kidnapping, we're not going to investigate the father. They continued to investigate him while exploring other options, which ultimately led them to arresting him and a conviction.
And it's unclear at this point, like how, like specifically, what did police do to kind of check the box and say, like, hey, we looked at this kidnapping theory and it worked. But they put out an Amber Alert. How is that something, like, if you're a prosecutor and the defense is saying, like, well, you just completely zeroed in on my client in the first case, like the fact that there was an Amber Alert that was put out, to me, shows that law enforcement at the time, like, absolutely took this story on face value and was really just focused on trying to find this girl. Unclear, even if he seems suspicious from the very beginning.
Yeah, and law enforcement, they have to take every possible step that they can to solve the case and to solve it appropriately. If they got word that this was a kidnapping, then yes, they're going to have to issue an Amber Alert, because in the event that it actually was and they failed to investigate, they're going to be in some pretty hot water for not exploring the possibility that she was in fact kidnapped. And that's the initial report that they got. So they had to follow that.
And I don't know how good of a defense this would have been, but just reading some of the snippets of these handwritten notes that were found in his vehicle, there were a couple that were found in his apartment. It just doesn't seem like he was mentally well. I'm not saying he was insane, but there's a lot that seemed to be going on in his head at this time. And on one hand, if you're a prosecutor, you say, well, that just shows that he was planning this to happen. Like, on the other hand, could there have been, instead of saying, like, no, she was definitely kidnapped, even though there wasn't really any evidence of that, like, how good of a defense could the mental health argument have been, being like, look, these notes just show someone who was not in the right frame of mind?
Well, I don't think that's going to do the defense any good, because the notes still show premeditation, essentially, that he planned to, at some point, murder his daughter. And so there's a timeline that takes place that shows step by step what his thoughts and what his frame of mind were at the time. I know that there was some notes that were ultimately found in his apartment at some point in time, which raised some suspicions of his mental health per se, or what his intent or motive was at the time with regard to his daughter. But it doesn't do them any well, because in New York, when you have mental health and things like that take place, and oftentimes too, when you challenge that in court and essentially say, judge, well, my client is not mentally fit to stand trial, they will order what we call a 730 exam. And that ultimately looks at the mental capacity of the individual. If the person is deemed not competent to stand trial, then the case is postponed and ultimately dismissed in certain circumstances, not in every, and the victim is committed to the psychiatric ward, for example. However, in a case like this, if they are able to get an expert that essentially will say, at the time that the offense took place, this was what this person was going through at that time, mental health incapacitations and things like that, there's an argument to be made when it comes to lack of intent. But I don't think that that was going to fare well for the defense in this case, considering all of the other circumstantial evidence that pointed to intent.
When it comes to sentencing, is that something that could, if the defense attorney wants to say, like, hey, we've all seen these notes, this is a guy who, again, was not in the right frame of mind, and could that have, and I'm not saying it will, and I don't think it should, just based off of how chilling this entire case was, but just thinking of things that the defense could say, like, is there, like, does mental health come into play in New York when it comes to a sentencing like this?
It can. And so what the defense will likely do is say, Your Honor, my client has this particular diagnosis that will also be reflected in the PSI if he's got mental health and other social circumstances that he may have encountered throughout his life. And so, Judge, we ask for the most lenient sentence, and, XYZ, my client has this diagnosis. He didn't mean to. He loves his daughter, blah, blah, blah. And if they're going to go in that direction, because he's also going to have the ability to appeal his conviction. So whatever arguments they take up on appeal, they're going to have to be very careful with what they say at sentencing and if they are going to admit responsibility. The judge can take that into consideration, but ultimately, this guy is going to spend the rest of his life in prison so long as his case doesn't come back on appeal.
And the fact that I mean, again, I keep coming back to the part that, like, on the night that she died, he allows her to call her mom and, hey, we're on our way home. We're going to be home in a couple of hours. And then he just does this unthinkable act after 10 days of them, and I'm sure what seemed like a great trip to New York City. It's just, it's just beyond words. Like, even if he were to give like the greatest speech in the history of speeches at his sentencing hearing, like, I always, and I've probably brought this up on previous episodes before, because like you go to these sentencing, and like it could be a very long thing, and someone could say, I'm very sorry. And then it's like the judge takes like 30 seconds and then says it seems like everything was predetermined ahead of time. Like, does anything actually at that hearing have an impact whatsoever on what a judge decides?
It can have an impact, but typically judges go into sentencing already knowing what they're going to do. They've sat through the trial, they've heard the evidence, they've seen the photos, they've seen the evidence, and they've gotten a chance to they themselves look at the family that's been impacted in that courtroom. They also, again, rely on that PSI or pre-sentence investigation that they get long before the actual sentencing to guide them in their sentence. And they have the sentencing guideline or sentencing range. And so this person is looking at life in prison without the possibility of parole. Again, I'm pretty certain that that will be the sentence of the court. The judge will also, if the family is going to give a victim impact statement, the judge will listen to them and what they have to say. I think in a case, this judge is not going to give too much credence to what the defendant might say, considering the heinous nature of this offense, murdering your own daughter. I don't think there's any excuse, rhyme, or reason or justification that a judge is going to think there is any way that this person should ever be let out of prison, or that I'm going to have any grace or mercy for this person. And I think he will absolutely give him the sentence that the law allows for him to sentence him to.
Yeah, and we'll see what happens in October. We cover true crime. These stories are terrible all the time. That's just the reality of it. But this one really sticks with you because it's just so horrific. Safa Robinson Ferrer, criminal defense attorney, former prosecutor. Always great to have your insight here on Law and Crime. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks, Chris. See you soon.
That will do it for On the Case, presented by Law and Crime. Subscribe to us on YouTube and Spotify, and we're also streaming on Peacock. I'm Chris Stewart. We'll see you next time.